All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this session. My name is Sarah Weitzel. I work for Tuscarora Intermediate Unit on the DITA project. I also have the opportunity to teach 2 online ESL classes. Just so you understand a little bit of my context and where I'm coming from. Both of my classes, the live element is fully online at this point. So as I'm talking about some of the things that I've shared in my own classroom, these are going to be lessons for live synchronous classes. But I think a lot of the things that I'll be showing could also be adapted for a face-to-face class as well. Just a couple notes before we get started. This session is being recorded. We will share the recording to the PA Adult Ed Resources page later after the conference is over. I have Bethany Lazanik with me here today. She is moderating this session. So if you have any technical questions, anything that she can help you with, you can message her directly in the chat and she'll be able to help you out. All right, so what are some things that I want to accomplish today? I know we only have a short hour together, and there are 3 things that I hope to be able to do within that time frame. First of all, before I really get into the heart of my lesson, where I share with you some things that I've done in my own classroom, I'd like to focus on our history just a little bit. That may seem like a kind of non-conventional place to start for a tech conference, but I'd like to look at the history of past language teaching methods. And my main question is, what do these past methods tell us about where we are today? I think that looking back a little bit helps us better understand where we are today. So that's kind of the perspective I'll be taking. Then I'd like to look at today's demands. My main question is, what challenges are today's language learners facing as they're communicating in digital settings? I think when we explore those 2 issues, the history and today's demands, it gives a really nice context and perspective when we move into the final part, which is where I focus on building digital literacy skills. And I like to explore the idea as I share, some things I've done in my own classroom of how we can build language skills and digital literacy skills for our students at the same time. So let's talk briefly a little bit about history. If you're someone who's familiar with past language teaching methods, you'll have to excuse me as I give just a very abbreviated history of these methods. I've chosen 3 pretty popular methods that I'd like to look at, kind of through the lens of exploring how over time as our knowledge of second language acquisition and education in general, as those have changed and expanded, as well as the fact that as our learners, the needs that they have with their language learning, as those have changed, our teaching methods have adapted as well. So first, let's think about the grammar translation method. Grammar translation method, if you think about language teaching methods before the 20th century, grammar translation method was pretty much it. Now, of course, there was also people were always learning from immersion. If they moved to a new area where a different language was spoken, of course, through exposure and through immersion, they would learn those languages. But in terms of a taught method, grammar translation method was the prevailing way to teach languages leading up to the 20th century. So in the grammar translation method, there was a heavy emphasis on reading and writing. The main goal for the students was to be able to learn a classic language like Greek or Roman, so that they could read classic literature. There was a big emphasis on translating these classic works from their original language to the student's native language. So a big emphasis on literacy with the reading and writing. One of the other goals in this process was the hope that students would understand their own native language grammar more thoroughly. So as they engaged in this method, they were hoping to understand their own native language a little bit more. So, on what we knew of language learning at the time and what the students needed to do, they wanted to learn classic languages. The grammar translation method worked for the demands the students were facing. But of course, throughout time, students have needed to use language for different reasons than simply reading and writing. And so another great example of a past language teaching method is the audiolingual method. The audiolingual method really became popular in the 1940s, and it was actually used a lot by the US military. During World War II, the demands that students, or in this case, that soldiers were facing, is that they were soon going to be deployed overseas. And so for these soldiers, there was a high stakes need to learn the language of where they were going, at least at a basic level. It could, it could be very beneficial for them to have at least a basic understanding of these other languages. So in this case, things like grammar translation method weren't going to work. The students didn't need to just be able to read and write in another language. They needed to be able to speak and communicate, at least at a basic level, in another language. So what did audiolingual method look like? Well, there were a lot of drills. The teacher would give a cue, and the soldiers would respond. Lots of repetition, lots of oral drills. And so one of the reasons that, we made the transition from a grammar translation method into audiolingualism was not only to help the students build up their speaking and listening ability, which is something, that was a demand that they were facing and needed to be able to meet, but it also expanded with our understanding of how the human brain works and how we acquire second languages. So at this time in psychology, there was a heavy influence from Skinner and the concept of behaviorism, that through conditioning, through repetition and conditioning, that someone could learn a new skill. So for that reason, we had a lot of the oral drills that the students were just repeating based upon the stimuli they had received. So the third method that I want to look at, and this is one that we still see a lot of influence today, is communicative language teaching, or CLT for short. We see a lot of CLT in people's teaching today, but it really had its heyday in the 70s and 80s. So what demands were students facing in this case? Well, teachers had started to observe that although the oral drills of audiolingualism, they worked very well for your highly motivated soldiers who really needed to know a new language because they were going to be deployed overseas. For your average student, this method, it wasn't so motivational. They were having a little trouble learning languages via audiolingualism. So Cannell and Swain, who were given most of the credit for developing CLT, they said, all right, what do our students need to do? In this case, they were looking at students who perhaps had moved to a new area. They needed to be able to not only speak with native speakers, but they needed to be able to complete everyday tasks. So in CLT, you'll see a lot of things like practicing dialogues. You'll see the use of authentic materials where students are reading or listening to passages that they may come across in regular life, reading a bus schedule, reading your child's school lunch menu. These are the types of things that we find in CLT. One of the things they emphasized in CLT was trying to build up communicative competence. Now, what exactly does that mean in communicative competence? Basically, it's the ability to create meaning using language. So when two people are speaking together, especially when two people who are learning the language are speaking together, there are lots of miscommunications as they're trying to gain proficiency in the language. Communicative competence is the ability to kind of overcome those miscommunications, to use whatever language resources you have at your disposal to get your message across. So with CLT, there's a really heavy emphasis on helping the students, build the language they can use to complete everyday tasks. It also helps them build their ability to complete language functions being things like asking for permission, denying a request, apologizing. Those things that we have to do with our language that kind of have a social element as well, that the teacher can help the students kind of unlock and understand. So where are we today? A lot of linguists and notable language teachers today say that we are in the post-methods era. So what exactly do we mean by that? In the post-methods area, I think Celsi and Murcia explain it well, that there's a focus on strong learning principles to meet the students' needs and goals. So in other words, a lot of teachers don't necessarily adhere to one particular method anymore. It's rare to find a completely audiolingual classroom or a completely CLT-based classroom. But what teachers are doing is they've taken the best of what we've learned from second language acquisition, the best of what we've learned from past teaching experiences, and we're applying those principles in our own classrooms. We're looking at what techniques work best for my students in their particular context. So if you're wondering at this point, so why are we talking about teaching methodology? This is a conference on technology, and I agree with you that that's the point here. But I think to help us better understand where we are today, it's useful to look at, some of the methods that have been used in the past. And what this leads me to see is that language teaching throughout the history of language teaching, it's evolved not only with our knowledge of second language acquisition, but we've also adapted it to meet the demands that our learners are facing. So whether it's learners who want to read classical texts, whether it's soldiers who are going to be deployed overseas, or whether it's somebody who wants to, build up their ability to function well, speaking in a second, third, or fourth language, our teaching methods over time have adapted to meet those demands. So where are we today? You don't have to look around very much to see that one of the big demands that our learners are facing is the need to be able to communicate in digital spheres or in a digital setting. I think we've especially seen in the past year, as lots of us have had to engage in online teaching and online learning, that this is a big topic, not only in education, but specifically for our language learners. It's a big topic that we need to be able to address. So what I'd like to do here before I move forward and talk a little bit about some of the demands that I'm seeing from today's learners is I'd like to get some information from you. If you have some thoughts about what types of demands our students are facing as they are attempting to communicate in digital settings, I'd like you to just take a minute here and share your thoughts in the chat. What challenges are you seeing students facing? What type of tasks do they need to be able to complete? What is it like for a language learner today to be communicating in a digital setting? So I'll leave a minute here in the chat if anybody is willing to share. Okay, this is great. I'm seeing some interesting information come in through the chat. We see some of the kind of more challenging elements of learning at home while your kids are there, kids coming into the classroom during online class. We're seeing the use of abbreviations, definitely an element with digital communication. More comments, mothers negotiating being in class while taking care of their kids. Of course, that's a big element that we're seeing with students. I see a couple comments about Zoom, understanding how to use the Zoom toolbar, understanding how to use Zoom reactions. Sure, we see a lot of that. I see one comment about using autocorrect on digital devices that can be confusing. I agree with you. I've seen that in my own classrooms. In fact, one of the student samples that I'm going to be showing later, you'll see how the student, it actually inserted a little bit of Spanish. Most of her work in her phone has been in Spanish, and it kind of auto-corrected what she meant to write into her native language. So a couple more Zoom comments. Okay, someone suggests that it's difficult to get tactile learners who would like to write on a board to use the chat. Okay, definitely a challenge. Typing. Some people don't have reliable technology at their disposal. Definitely an issue. Internet connection. Yeah, thank you for your comments in the chat. I think you bring up a lot of great challenges that students are facing. And, you know, as language instructors, we know that the challenge is already high for our students. Learning a second, third, fourth, really learning any language other than your native language, it takes time, it takes practice, and it's really quite difficult. So as we consider some of the challenges that they're facing in a digital setting, it adds a double layer of challenge. But I think, as I'll show you later on in my presentation, I think this is a challenge that we can meet. So again, thanks for sharing your comments. So before we really talk a whole lot more about the challenges that students are facing, let's think about some of the challenges that we have. We know as instructors that from a standards-based perspective, that teaching digital literacy is something that we are required to do. So whether you're working with the ELPS or the CCRS, there's definitely, we can see a clear demand that digital literacy is something that we want to be integrating into our classrooms. So with the ELPS, of the many guiding principles that helped lead to the formation of the ELPS with guiding principle 9, we see that there's a demand to use multimedia technology to integrate it into design of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. The goal being that it will help your students be college and career ready. So, you know, the overall principles that helped lead to the formation of the ELPS, they're telling us, okay, integrating technology is important for helping your students be prepared for college and careers. If you want to look more specifically at some of the standards in standard 3 around levels 4 and 5, of course, we know that students need to be able to speak and write at an appropriate level for their proficiency about different informational and literary texts. But as they're doing that, we also want them to be able to integrate graphics and multimedia. So in other words, how can the message that they're trying to portray, their spoken or written message, how can that be enhanced through digital literacy by integrating graphics and multimedia? This is something we'll explore a little bit as we get into the heart of my lesson. Now, from the perspective of the CCRS, with speaking and listening anchor 5, we want students to make strategic use of digital media and visual displays as a way of enhancing their audience's understanding of their presentations. So this is a very similar concept to what we see in ELP Standard 3, where students are using their digital literacy skills to enhance their message. They're pulling in audio and perhaps video, they're pulling in images to enhance what they're saying. So both ELP Standard 3 and Speaking and Listening Anchor 5, they have to do a lot with production. What is the student producing to go along with their spoken or written message? And as language teachers, we know that producing, you know, being able to produce language is an important element. But with Writing Anchor 8, we also see that digital literacy isn't just about producing information, but it's also about consuming information. So as students are, you know, doing their own writing, they need to be able to gather information, relevant information from multiple sources. They need to assess if they're credible and accurate, and then they need to integrate that into their own writing. So just like we know as language teachers that we want our students not only to be able to produce language in speaking and writing, but we also want them to be able to consume and understand it with their listening and reading skills. The same applies with digital literacy, that our students need to be able to produce and consume digital media. So we see that in terms of standards, you and I as language teachers, we're called upon to integrate digital literacy into our classroom. But there are also some very practical reasons why we want to do this as well. You listed in the chat a lot of really great points about some of the demands that our students are facing as they're not only learning language, but they're trying to communicate in a digital setting. So some of the demands that I thought of that our learners are facing is, first of all, a lot of them are trying to help their children do online schooling. Um, so a certain level of digital literacy is required there as they're trying to help guide and lead their children through this new setting, this new learning setting. A lot of our students' lives are online in a digital setting, just like ours are as well. Maybe they're doing online banking. Maybe they have social media profiles. Maybe they're trying to look for work online. Just like many of us have kind of these elements of our lives are at least partially online, it's the case for our students as well. So whether they're trying to help their children, whether they're trying to, access their online banking statements, they need a certain level of digital literacy. Our students are also engaged online socially. This was especially true as earlier in the pandemic when it was more difficult to get out and interact with others. Our students were finding socialization online. I think this is also true for many students. They may have family who doesn't live nearby. So they may rely on online technologies, whether it's, online chat, whether it's Zoom, video conferencing, they're relying on a digital setting to be able to stay in contact with the people who matter to them most. And finally, for many of us, our own students are also learning online. Maybe they're helping their kids, but they're also in our classes often engaging in online learning. They may also need to be working remotely. So really our students, there are a lot of practical reasons, a lot of very practical needs that our students need to have met, from helping their children to engaging in their own social lives to trying to learn and work online. So whether it's from a standards perspective, whether it's from just a practical perspective that you want to help your students have the tools they need to, engage in life as it is today, we can see that there's a need to integrate our language instruction and digital literacy instruction. And so that kind of leads me to my second point of the presentation, that I really believe that addressing students' digital literacy and language learning needs is a demand not only that we should meet, but it's one that I think we can meet. If we think about the way that past teaching methods evolved, not only with our understanding of how language is taught, but to help our students meet the demands of the day, I think that we can do the same thing today. And that's what I'd like to show you as I get into my lessons. Now, before I get into my lessons, just a couple notes. I've been throwing out this term digital literacy quite a bit. So maybe at this point, it's good to have a definition. When I speak about digital literacy, what am I speaking about? In broad terms, I like the American Library Association's definition. They define digital literacy as the ability to use information and communication technologies to find, evaluate, create, and communicate information, requiring both cognitive and technical skills. Now, what is it about this particular definition that I like? Well, the first part that stands out to me is that, again, there's that element of students both producing and consuming digital media. They need to be able to find, evaluate, create, and communicate information. So just like in language, how we want to teach our students to be able to consume and produce language, in digital literacy, we want to do the same thing. I also like the very end of this definition. It mentions that digital literacy requires both cognitive and technical skills. And I think this is a really important part of the definition. In some cases, when people think of digital literacy, they may think of kind of the more technical side. My students need to be able to use a mouse. They need to be able to use a keyboard. They need to be able to log on to Zoom. And these are all absolutely true. Without some of those baseline technical skills, students will struggle with online learning. And so we do need to be able to give the students opportunities to practice these skills. We need to model these skills for our students. But I think another important element of digital literacy is that it includes cognitive skills as well. So in my own classrooms, of course, I first work to help my students build those basic technical skills, but that is so that we can scaffold up to and get to the point where their use of digital media will help enhance their learning experience, that that they will be learning language even more as they interact with my digital literacy focused lessons. Now, if you want to get a little bit more specific, or if you want to learn more about, what are some standards regarding digital literacy, I suggest that you check out the ISTE standards for students. In the ISTE standards, there are basically 7 definitions of what a digitally literate student is, starting from an empowered learner, going all the way down to bottom as a global collaborator. Under each of these descriptions, there are some specific standards that describe what students need to be able to do to be a digitally literate student. Now, as a language instructor, all 7 of these definitions are important, but the ones that I really like to focus on are 6 and 7, the creative communicator and global collaborator. I think when I show you a brief description of each of those, that we'll begin to see, okay, there's actually some overlap between what my students are learning in terms of digital literacy and what they're doing as language learners. So who is a creative communicator? A creative communicator is a student who could communicate clearly and express themselves for a variety of purposes. They can use different platforms, tools, styles, formats, and digital media appropriate for their goals. So at first, this seems like a lot. Okay, I know as a language instructor, I want my students to be able to communicate clearly, but how can I teach them all the platforms, tools, styles, and formats? I don't really think that's the purpose. I don't know all of them. I definitely can't teach all of them. But what's important here is that I'm finding the tools that are appropriate to help my students reach their own goals. So whatever it is that they'd like to do with their language, I'd like to find the tools to help them enhance that. And really, isn't that one of the main ideas behind teaching adults as well, that we're helping to integrate their own goals into their educational experience? So the global collaborator is a student who can use digital tools to broaden their perspectives and enrich their learning. They do this by collaborating with others and working effectively in teams. So if we just step back for a minute, think about your own experience learning languages, or think about what you've observed through your own students. Learning a language really is an exercise in broadening your perspective. You get to meet people from different places, perhaps than where you're from. You get to hear lots of different perspectives, lots of different ways of seeing the world. So language learners already are focusing more on being those global collaborators, on having those broad perspectives, and having their learning enriched by others. And so when ISTE points out what a global collaborator is from a digital literacy standpoint, I think we see that there's a lot of overlap between language instruction and digital literacy instruction. So if we haven't already started to see how it's the case, I really like to make the case that the language instructor and the digital literacy instructor, that they have similar complementary goals. How is this the case? Well, on the screen, I have a couple of those language principles I talked about earlier. There are some things that we know about language learning that we like to try to consider as we're creating lessons and activities. And I really believe that as we're considering some of these principles in our planning, that it really aligns well with including digital literacy instruction in our classrooms. So first, we know that language learning is social. We know from Vygotsky, for education in general, that there's a strong social element to learning, that when we're interacting with each other, we're learning from each other. The same is definitely true for language learning, that the more we can have our students interacting together, the more it helps them acquire the language. We also know, I've talked about this a little bit, we know that students need communicative competence. Again, that means students need to be able to develop the skills, even at a lower proficiency level, to find a way to kind of get their message across, to overcome misunderstandings, and to create meaning with their language. This kind of, I think, aligns well with the ISTE's concept of a creative communicator, someone who can effectively communicate. Point 3, we know that interaction encourages language acquisition. Long's interaction hypothesis tells us that it's not enough just to hear and read the language. It's not enough just to receive that language input, but we also need to take what we're hearing and we need to interact with others. When we're interacting with others, we get feedback, we begin to understand where we're making mistakes, and we kind of stretch ourselves a little bit more to use and apply the language. So in a similar way to the idea that language learning is social, we also know that interaction is needed to really acquire that language. So with interaction, we see some overlap with the global communicator, someone who's learning from other perspective, interacting and collaborating with others. Point 4 is not specifically related to language, but if we think about Bloom's taxonomy, we know that creation is the highest level of the taxonomy. That whenever you're learning information, that when you can create something new, you can create something novel based upon what you've learned, that you're at that really high functioning level with learning. And so I think that the same is true with language, that when students are able to take their language to create something new and novel, to present in a new idea or better explain their own perspective, that they're engaging and learning at a high level. And so this, again, if we think about the digital literacy standards, this fits well with the creative communicator. So thanks for sticking with me for the first part of this. We looked at a little bit of history and saw how past teaching methods have adapted to meet learners' needs. We looked at the needs that learners are facing today, and it leads me to the insertion that we not only can, but we should be teaching our students language and digital literacy at the same time. And we saw how if we look at the standards and we look at some core learning principles about language, we can see some overlapping complementary goals. So what I'd like to do for the second half of this session is I have 3 examples from my own lessons where I have, whether intentionally or not, found some ways to integrate some digital literacy instruction into my language lessons. So I just like to give you some examples to show you what we talked about in class, what particular tools I used, and most importantly, what were my main takeaways. I know that for you, as you're seeking to either begin integrating digital literacy into your language classroom or to enhance what you're already doing, my hope is that some of these takeaways that I gained from my own experience, that they'll help you think about ways that you can approach this topic within your own classroom. So what I'd like to do before I move on to my lesson is I'm going to check the chat to see if there are any particular questions that I can answer right now.
Sarah, you just had a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you have a question that just came in from Sarah Cole.
Okay.
She said, what level of ELLs are these digital literacy integration lessons done with?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for your question here. So the lessons that I'm going to be showing you, I have a really multi-level classroom. I have students who are, just beginning to students who are pretty advanced, who are nearly ready to move on to move out of an ESL classroom. So in my case, I'll be showing examples of work from my lower level and higher level students. Basically, this is a long way of saying that my examples apply to students from many different proficiency levels. Yeah, so at that point, I guess that's the only question there. Let me move forward. So the first type of lesson I'm going to show you is a lesson that I had already written. It was a pre-existing lesson written only for language instruction. And I realized as I was going to reteach it one particular day, oh, there's an opportunity here. I can integrate some digital literacy into this lesson. And so, we have a lot of teachers here in the room with us today. I'm sure that you have a whole bank of lessons that you like to rely on. Maybe they don't include digital literacy right now. But this is just an example of one case where that was the case for me, and I found some ways to integrate digital literacy into the lesson. So for this particular sample lesson, the topic we were covering was cover letters. It was a very workforce focused type of lesson. The students had written some cover letters in a lesson before. So we got to this particular lesson where they were going to give each other some constructive criticism, you know, peer feedback, learning from each other as a way to improve their own writing. Our particular grammar form, we had been focusing a lot on the second conditional. You know, if you would change this, it could lead to that. We were focusing on that grammar form as a way to give not only useful, but also polite feedback to each other. The tool that we used was pretty simple. We just used Google document comments. All the cover letters had been written in Google Documents and shared in a shared class folder. So simply the students were going into each other's cover letters and giving some Google document comments. So at this point, I want to be clear, all the tools that I'm using, all the tools that I'll give as an example, none of them are necessarily the most cutting edge. I won't claim to, you know, blow your mind with how cutting edge and new these tools are. But my main focus in choosing tools was just choosing the simplest form to help the students achieve their goal. So how did this lesson go? Well, first we focused a little bit on the structure of a cover letter. I had taken a sample cover letter and broken it up into pieces, and the students had gone through and sorted it into a sequence that they thought was logical. Then as a class, we talked about the purpose of each section. Why would a writer include this section? What might their purpose be? We talked about this thing as a class, and we filled in the information together. After that, I had a form set up for each student. They each had their own form saved in the shared Google Doc folder, where they could go in and answer questions that essentially helped them fill out each section of your standard cover letter. And so, you know, I like the question, what level students are you working with in these lessons? In this case, as you'll see here on the screen, I had a very beginning level student who was working with this form. So, you know, where did you find the job post? Her answer, agency. What job are you interested in? She's interested in a factory job. She's just answering at the word level. And for this particular student's proficiency level, that was appropriate. That's what she's able to produce right now. So I was happy with what she had put together. She essentially made a little skeleton of a cover letter. Now, you might notice someone had mentioned in the chat at the beginning of the session about the struggle with autocorrect on students' devices. Here we see this student that I observed as she was typing it, she typed something in English and it autocorrected back to Spanish. So that is a challenge that some learners are facing. But so this is an example of something that one of my lower level students was able to produce. Here we have one of the most advanced students in the class, and just even visually, even if you don't read the whole thing, you can see the different level of work that she was able to produce. We see complete sentences. She's beginning to form paragraphs. This is essentially, if she took away my comments from the form, you would have a complete cover letter right here. So for these students, one of the things that I really like about trying to integrate some digital literacy into the classroom is that for the students, whether they're at the beginning level or much more advanced, they're able to work on the same goals, but at a level that's appropriate for their proficiency. So both of these students at the end have produced an appropriate level cover letter for their proficiency. And I really liked the results. So the students had written these cover letters together, and we got back together in class the next day. And before they gave each other some constructive criticism, we had to talk about this topic together. What is constructive criticism? What does it mean? What does it look like? So we had a nice discussion about kind of the definition of constructive criticism. And then I apologize for how small the font is here, but the students also, we integrated some second conditional here. We had been focusing on this grammar form. They applied it here. So we thought of, in general, what are some mistakes that people make in writing, and what kind of advice could you give them to improve? So it's a little small to see, but that first example, the students wrote it together. It says your writing would be better if you included more details. The bottom one I like as well. Your writing would be more interesting if you added examples. So they're using that second conditional form and to try to think, okay, how might we give feedback to each other. What types of problems might we see in each other's writing? Before I had the students go and start giving feedback on each other's letters, I did want them to practice on one that I put together. So I wrote a cover letter, tried to, add plenty of mistakes that hopefully they would find. And we started using Google Doc comments to give feedback on my cover letter. So I'll zoom in a little bit so you can kind of see what some of their comments were. You'll see at the top, one student is reminding me that I need to be more formal in my greeting. He was right on with that. And then down below, there's also some students who are helping to correct my spelling as well. So how does a lesson like this, I've made the claim that we can teach language and digital literacy at the same time if we keep in mind some good, strong language teaching principles, as well as some digital literacy standards. So how does this particular lesson align? Well, in terms of language instruction, we see the concept of interaction coming into play. When students interact, they get and communicate together, they get feedback from each other. They begin to see, okay, here's where I'm not clear. Maybe I need to try this a different way. And really, isn't that kind of the concept behind peer feedback, that students are working together to help clarify their own communication? We also see an element of social learning here. The students' social learning, we see from Vygotsky, we see the concept that students, a student at a higher level can help kind of draw up the level of the lower students. So again, with peer feedback, the students are helping each other to improve their own writing. In terms of digital literacy, I find elements of Global Collaborator Standard 7B here, that students are using collaborative technologies to work with others to examine issues and problems from multiple multiple viewpoints. In this case, the issue that they're examining is each other's writing, and they're trying to find the problems and help each other overcome them. So what is my main takeaway from a lesson like this? Well, the first thing that I'd really like to encourage you to do as you consider ways to integrate digital literacy into your own language instruction is to make sure that you're always making opportunities for students to learn from each other. A really simple tool like Google Document Comments can help students begin to collaborate, can help students, give each other comments on their writing in a way that they're learning from each other. So as you're considering what tools you use, if you want your students to be collaborating, find ways for them to learn from each other. You also want to make sure to leave time for practice. Leave lots of time for practice. As language instructors, we know that for a student to really acquire a piece of language, that they're comfortable using it and applying it, it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of repetition. And the same is true for digital literacy. The grammar form that we were focusing on for this lesson was the second conditional, and you might have noticed that none of the students used that in their comments. I was a little disappointed. I had hoped that they would be able to do that. But the examples I gave you from this lesson, it was the students' first time using Google Doc Comments. So they were already stretching, they were working pretty hard to use this new tool that they hadn't used before. So it was okay for me that they didn't also have to reach really hard for that harder grammar form. The goal here being that with time, they would be able to start using the tool and the language at the same time.
Sarah, you had a question come in about that topic.
Mm-hmm.
From Sarah Cole. She says, I like how you integrated English, workforce prep, and digital literacy practice, but I wonder what your students already knew about Google Docs. Did you explicitly teach Google Docs? If yes, how did you go about doing this? She said, I find many students aren't necessarily familiar with Google Docs or a word processing app program prior to coming to an English class.
Okay, yes. Thank you for your comment there. So I would say that my students had already kind of had like a mid-level knowledge of Google Docs. We use Google Docs frequently in my classroom for producing writing. And so when the students had to write their own cover letters, kind of fill in that form I had given them, that was not new for them. That is something that we had practiced a lot in class. It's something that I had modeled for them frequently. What was new for them was using the Google comments. So they were working with a tool they were already familiar with, but we were pulling in a new element. And so how did I prepare them for this? Well, I, of course, modeled on both my share screen with my computer, and then I also keep a share screen open with my cell phone as well. So for students who are working on a smaller device, they can kind of see what it looks like to add that Google Doc comment. And then I also tried to give them a setting where they could practice on my writing, you know, a kind of safe, low stakes environment before they would give comments to each other. Now, you know, they didn't use the grammar form I was looking for. So in that regard, I see some areas for me to make some improvement, to give them time to practice with these new tools more before I expect them to, you know, integrate the language and digital literacy together. So appreciate your comment. I hope that answers your question. All right, so that's the first lesson. The last two I may need to go through just a little bit faster, so we'll have time for questions at the end. But again, as we're focusing on building digital literacy, here I'm going to show you a lesson and a unit that I had written where I intentionally integrated digital literacy and language instruction together. Okay, so for this next sample lesson, the students, this was part of a unit. The students had been learning about personal goals. Early in the unit, they had set their own SMART goal for something in their own lives that they wanted to achieve within the month time frame that we were doing this lesson. At the end, the culminating assignment is that they were going to teach each other about their own goals. They had spent a lot of time establishing their goals, reading about their goals, you know, even speaking to an expert about how they could achieve their goals. And so the last step was for them to be able to take what they had learned and share it with their classmates. The grammar form here was pretty simple. We were working with ordinal numbers. Basically, what the students needed to do as they were teaching each other was to sequence, you know, the steps of what they needed to do to achieve their own goal. So the ordinal numbers was helpful in that case. The tool they used was Adobe Spark. If you're not familiar with Adobe Spark, it's a free web-based tool from Adobe where students can build lots of neat interactive products. In this case, they were simply creating some slides, but it integrated their own voice recordings. It integrated images. They could add music to the background. It just really opened the door for the students to get pretty creative with their message. So working with Adobe Spark, this is a tool that was more challenging than something like Google Doc comments. So in this case, I tried to give them lots of opportunities to plan before they started interacting with the tool, and also to get some practice just playing with the tool in the classroom before they had to present their own information. So first, in terms of planning, I asked them to think about the steps that they needed to follow to reach their goal. Of course, they were going to share this information with their students. So we started at the word level. Can you describe in one word what you need to do in each of your 3 steps? Then I had them, you know, kind of expand a little bit more. If they had the proficiency to do it, okay, take this one word idea and put it into a sentence. If you had to describe to someone in one sentence what your next step looks like, how would you do that? So there was lots of time for them to plan. The day when they got to start learning about Adobe Spark, we also needed to have some shared vocabulary. Whenever you're working with a tool with students, there's often specific vocabulary that goes with each tool. So make sure that you're all understanding the same vocabulary. So we talked about, you know, what is a slide? How do you record your voice? These were just a couple of important words for them to be able to use this tool. With anything with teaching digital literacy, modeling is really important. So I created my own short little video. This is just a screenshot, so I can't play it, but created a short little video so they could kind of get an idea of what the end product may look like. Of course, I didn't want them to just copy mine, but I wanted to give them a model of what it may look like. We then had some directions for the students to follow. We had been also talking a little bit about modals of necessity. So I told them the 5 things that they must include in their presentation, and then some things they ought to include. They didn't have to, but they could include images, a theme, and music. So in this class, we had a lot of time. Basically, we talked about the vocabulary. I modeled how to use different features of Adobe Spark. And then I left the class open. The students kind of logged in, they played with Adobe Spark. They asked me questions about how to integrate different features. And they just were able to begin getting familiar with the tool. So after that class was over, they had their directions. They had already planned what they wanted to say and include in their presentation. So they had a week to make their presentation. And I was really pleased. As the week progressed, I started getting invites from the students to see their presentations. In this case, I thought it was kind of cute. The student gave me a little message. I did my best. So let me show you what this particular student's, what her presentation looked like when she was finished. So this is, we'll let that load up. This is Adobe Spark. Oh, I would like to note that I got the idea for using Adobe Spark from it was a 2018 PACE conference presentation. Hannah Schlosser had presented using Adobe Spark. I thought that's a great tool. I'd like to try it on my own. So here's a quick preview of what the student was able to create. She would like to have her own bakery. She did previously own one in her home country. So this is what she made to share with her fellow students.
First, I must have a place to start working on my bakery. Second, I have to let people know about my bakery through marketing. And third, I have to open the bakery to the public to start doing business and sell my cakes.
All right, now that froze a little bit. There was one thing I wanted to show. One of the things that I thought was really neat, I'll just show you the slide here, was that the student was able to use images of, these were all cakes and desserts that she had made. She also shared an image of the former bakery that she used to own. So as she was teaching her fellow students, as she was using those ordinal numbers to sequence the steps, she was also able to pull in some images that were valuable to her and really enhanced her message. So what were my takeaways here? I really like to emphasize teaching digital literacy skills that help your students create more meaning with their language. You know, again, if we look at how does a lesson like this apply to language instruction? Well, here we see communicative competence coming into play. The students are, you know, planning what they want to say. They're considering what their audience needs to know, and it helps them to be a more effective communicator. This also applies to the concept of ISTE, of the creative communicator, someone who communicates clearly and who uses multimedia to enhance their message. So in your own lessons, whatever you might have students creating using their new digital literacy skills, you know, make sure that it helps them enhance their own message, just like it did for this student as she was able to pull in her voice recording and her images of her bakery to enhance her own message. Okay, so this is a great question. Someone is asking, any idea if Adobe Spark requires a higher level of bandwidth? For example, when I used VoiceThread, a short video created within that took forever to load with slower internet. You know what, that's a great question. None of my students got back to me and complained of this being a problem, but I can see how that could be the case. There's a lot of use of like images, audio recordings, and they can even apply music. So if your students are having trouble with low bandwidth, this might not be the right tool for them. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, we're getting close to the end here, and this one is nice and short. I'd like to show you my last sample lesson. In this case, we were looking at the concept of community maps. Now, what the students were doing here, we used a tool called EtherMap. It's a pretty simple tool. This one would be easier to use for students with low bandwidth. The students had a map that we had saved of our home location. Most of us are in Mifflintown, Pennsylvania. So I had saved a map that the students were all able to log into and to edit on their own. They were able to add pins of locations that they find important, and they were able to write descriptions of those locations. The main goal here is we were trying to create a product that we could share with new students. If someone new moved into the area and wanted to know where are the relevant locations, we would be able to share this with them. The function here, what they were doing is collaborating. They were working together to think of important locations to share and how they might do that. The goal was for them to be able to write a description of the location in addition to dropping a pin on the map. So we learned about prepositional phrases. And all the lessons that we did to help build up to this were via Nearpod. So the students, I offered these Nearpod lessons synchronously. Nearpod is a tool that allows you to build, to get feedback from the students. You know, they can interact and answer questions and submit their own writing as the lesson is progressing. So we use this synchronously. Nearpod also can be used in an asynchronous setting. So for our students, you know, we did a couple lessons about prepositional phrases. The students learned how to, you know, understand them and to produce them. And so we finally got to the last lesson where they were going to create their map together. And so again, modeling is important. The first thing I did is I had created a little video for them showing them just exactly how to edit these maps. I also gave the students some directions. These directions were available for them on our Nearpod lesson. At any point as they were working on their map, they could come back to and refer to these directions, in addition to being able to ask me. I was there with them as well. So here's just a zoomed in feature of our little map. I had saved Mifflintown as our location that we were going to work on together. And you can see there are some pins here. Students had marked some locations that were important to them. So one particular student, she had put her name at the top. I covered that to help her to say, I can't think of the word. I covered her name up for her privacy, but you can see what the goal was is that she was able to drop the pin and then she gave her description. She said family practice is near Sheets. So really no endorsement of any particular business is meant during this presentation. But why she chose this particular location, at this particular family practice, there's a doctor on staff who can speak Spanish. For her and her own experience, this had been important. And she said if someone is new and moves to town and they speak Spanish, they might want to have a doctor who speaks Spanish too. So for her, this was a location she wanted to share with a potential newcomer. This same student also pointed out where the pool is. She said the pool is between the park and the baseball park too. This is true. This particular pool is between two parks. So she was able to say, she had said in class that if someone had children, they might want to know where the pool is. She wanted to share that information. So we're getting really close to the end here. How does this align with language instruction? Well, we see the social element. The students are considering, what do other people need to know? I'd like to share that with them. And this also, I didn't list this as one of the key, language principles, but it also aligns well with Ladson and Billings' culturally responsive pedagogy. One of the principles behind culturally responsive pedagogy is that the students' own experiences are an essential element of what you cover in the classroom. So here, they were able to share their own experience with relevant locations. We also see that the students were being global collaborators. They were using digital tools to connect with other people. In this case, it was an imagined person, the newcomer, but they were using that digital tool to help that hypothetical person. So this leads me to my final point, is that building digital literacy. I'd also like you to consider that it's a great opportunity to build classroom community. So a tool like Get Ethermap, it's really easy to work with, low bandwidth, and it's something that students can work on together to share with someone else. So we covered the objectives. We kind of looked at the history of language teaching. We saw where we are today, and I gave you a couple examples from my own classroom. And so we have 1 minute to go. If there are any other questions, I can take them now. And I'll also, while that question comes in, show you my final references.